Hurstman Zoo Quaker meeting has been talking about how to respond to the centennial of the outbreak of war in 1914. This presentation is the result.
Its themes are retribution and reconciliation and learning from history, if we ever can learn from history.
As the presentation was prepared by a Quaker meeting, we should say something about the background of Quakers.
Quakers appeared in the aftermath of the English Civil War. This was a traumatic experience. The casualties per head of population were actually higher than those of the First World War.
The peace testimony was presented by the Quaker leader George Fox to Charles II in 1660. It started, "We are called upon to live in the virtue of that life and power that takes away the occasion of all wars." Since then, many Quakers have refused to take part in war.
Harry Lime in the 1940s film The Third Man. He's a crook trafficking fake penicillin. From the top of the Ferris wheel in Vienna, he speaks to his friend. 1914 started the full realization of his philosophy.
Harry Lime said, "Nobody thinks in terms of human beings. Governments don't. Why should we?"
Would you really feel any pity if one of those dots stopped moving forever?
Quakers reject what Harry Lime says. They believe that each one of us is unique, precious, a child of God.
The life of each person matters as much as the life of every other person.
If we kill, we are wiping out a whole world which can never be replaced.
Human beings are not to be treated as disposable rubbish. It's impossible to present an account of history completely objectively. So this presentation tries to raise questions for discussion. Even so, you'll need to watch out for our own point of view creeping in, even in the way we have selected the facts. We can make our own pattern of the facts. It's like arranging books on a shelf. They can be arranged in all sorts of ways, by author, title, subject, or even by colour or size.
We have been told that Britain had no choice about declaring war when Germany invaded Belgium. The 1839 Treaty of London guaranteed Belgian neutrality.
Really? Cabinet members dithered about going to war. Foreign Secretary Edward Grey said, "Up to the present moment, we did not feel that any treaties or obligations of this country were involved."
The Kaiser was amazed that a scrap of paper, the Treaty of London, was actually treated seriously. This remark was easily taken up by British propaganda. Suddenly, there was an appeal to honour. So a warning. Well-known facts should be treated with caution. We suggest that August 1914 was not just the start of World War I. It opened a story of European carnage which lasted until 1945, with a 22-year break in the middle.
The cartoon shows plucky little Belgium resisting the German bully.
The long, long trail of suffering.
The railway carriage at Compiègne, where the 1918 armistice conditions were forced on the cowed German representatives.
Pointedly used by Hitler to humiliate France in 1940.
Reconciliation sculpture at Coventry, devastated by German bombing but later twinned with Dresden.
Many people argue that the demonisation of the enemy from the first days of the war set the scene for the retribution visited on Germany after the ceasefire. In our discussion, we shall look carefully at that point of view.
In contrast, the behaviour of the victorious Allies after 1945 opened the way for reconciliation, a transformation of Germany and lasting peace between former enemies.
Kaiser Wilhelm in cheerful conversation with his cousin George V at the funeral of Edward VII.
By 1914, the image of Kaiser Bill had changed. Suddenly the word Kaiser was hissed out with hatred. We can probably think of other pals turned demons from later history. Here is an arrangement of the facts we can take as a starting point, and one way of looking at round one of the long European spasm.
The spirit of hatred was stirred up in the first days of the war. The Germans certainly brought much of this on themselves when they invaded Belgium. These days we would call it a crime of aggression.
They devastated cities.
Citizens were warned that they would be punished if they resisted the German advance.
Then they shot Belgian civilians as reprisals for being fired on by civilians, so they said. This was just about acceptable at the time. Only soldiers were supposed to fire at enemy soldiers. But the Germans carried out reprisals on a brutally efficient and massive scale.
Men wouldn't volunteer to preserve something abstract like the balance of power, so basic emotions had to be tapped. Posters like this suddenly appeared to encourage recruitment. The real outrages were bad enough, without being given a sensational gloss such as
women in a state of undress pursued by lustful Huns, babies impaled on bayonets, and so a whole nation was depicted as a savage brute. Will people believe anything when bombarded with such images of the enemy? Did the poster designers actually believe what they produced? How did people see the world in 1914?
boys were taught manliness.
I ask not for his lineage, I ask not for his name. If manliness be in his heart, he noble birth may claim.
Playing the game translated into readiness for war.
An appeal was made to history, the yeomen of England.
A very effective poster appealing to manhood and honour. Who would want to be left out of the great patriotic surge?
Especially when women were handing out white feathers.
War was presented as something noble, purifying, and manly. The quotation reads, "The war would cleanse mankind of all its impurities." There was much emphasis on the king and the flag.
We don't want to fight, but by jingo, if we do, we've got the men, we've got the ships, we've got the money too. Of course, it's easy to scoff at how deferential and gullible people were. How far have we moved on? Perhaps we are still gullible and deferential, but about different things. And of course, there's also the problem of hindsight. We didn't know then what we know now.
And so our common humanity took a back seat. Our boys were just that, boys. The image comes from the first film to look war in the eye, All Quiet on the Western Front.
The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pool, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds.
These are unofficial photographs taken by a German soldier, too bleak to be used for propaganda. The cavalry is especially compelling.
Another image from All Quiet on the Western Front. A meeting with a French soldier the German has just killed. I am the enemy you killed, my friend. I knew you in this dark, for so you frowned. Yesterday through me as you jabbed and killed, I parried, but my hands were loath and cold. Let us sleep now.
And German soldiers tending a wounded French soldier. We hope that it is not set up for propaganda. Oh, What a Lovely War and Blackadder are satiric accounts of the war with moments of pathos. These have moulded the attitudes of two generations.
The lions led by donkeys story has become deeply embedded with us.
The 11th of November 1918. The Empire and Dominions share the sense of triumph.
The photos show celebrations on Armistice Day 1918 at the front.
And at home.
The poppies and war memorials still compel our attention.
But there was also an ugly mood of revenge against the chosen demon.
Here is another pattern of explanations which has become widespread. Contrary to the idea that Germany was mainly to blame, it was argued that the main actors of 1914 had no choice because of the balance of power doctrine. After the first domino fell, the whole row collapsed. The Kaiser was told, "We can't stop it now. The troop trains are heading towards the Belgian frontier."
The diagram shows the Triple Entente, France, Russia, Britain, and the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria and Italy, although Italy changed sides later. The sleepwalkers. Did anyone know what they were doing in 1914? Does anyone ever know what they are really doing? Historians still disagree strongly about the sleepwalker story and whether Germany was the main culprit.
Going back to the arranging books in a library idea, here is one story which was widely accepted between the wars and is still current today. After about 1930, many people came to question Germany's total responsibility for the carnage. It was argued that the reparations and humiliating restrictions on her pride as a nation were unjust. This account persisted as an explanation of the renewal of fighting in 1939.
British, French and American leaders believed that the Treaty of Versailles would sort out the German threat. But the cartoon already raises doubts. The tiger, Clemenceau says, "Curious, I seem to hear a child weeping." Germany as the crippled patient with a stereotypical Jewish doctor in attendance.
The occupation of the Ruhr by France.
Galloping inflation.
Rise of the Nazis.
The failure to stem the tide by well-meaning people like Neville Chamberlain.
And so it starts all over again. Is there substance in this story, or is it just a Nazi ploy? Perhaps there is much in it, but it still needs handling with care. Here's a slant on history we can discuss later.
Our story continues. We won the second round of the long European war, but this time we also won the peace. In 1945 there was rejoicing once again, but calls for revenge were muted.
On VE Day, Field Marshal Montgomery insisted that this time we must win the peace. This implied that the mistakes of 1918 must not be repeated.
British forces did more than chat up the girls.
The officers in charge of the British occupation zone were shocked at the state of the people. Officially, they were supposed to be cold, distant disciplinarians. When it came to it, they acted in a caring, if rather paternalistic way.
An early British communiqué said, "The devastation and dislocation in Western Germany is on a scale far greater than in any other occupied zone." Soon the policy reflected the need to bring Germany in from the cold and to avoid the failures of 1918. Some official aims were agreed. So this time round, there was a determination to bring Germany in out of the cold. This is in marked contrast to the Soviet approach in their zone of Germany, which was to crush and totally control it. How much good did that do them in the long run?
There had been a 1,000-year conflict between what became France and Germany over territories stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, like the Great War trenches. The devastation visited on the people from Flanders to Alsace-Lorraine over the centuries is not being repeated.
1945 was the start of a slow reconciliation with Germany, in contrast with the false peace of 1918.
We are familiar with the military victory and how Britain resisted the Nazis. The stories of the Battle of Britain, Dunkirk and D-Day are repeated over and over again. It is part of our national identity.
But we hear little of the moral and political victory, which owed much to the work of our armed forces. We should take pride in this.
It is a cause for celebration.
The motives were not pure, of course. They never are. One defeated enemy was rapidly replaced by another. The aircrew bringing relief to Berlin to raise the Soviet blockade might well have been bombing the city a few years before. Did the cameraman happen to be walking by when he just came upon this nicely composed group the moment the plane was coming into land?
The Nuremberg Tribunal has often been called victor's justice, but at least it established individual responsibility for war crimes and crimes of aggression more firmly than the hang the Kaiser approach.
Year Zero meant starting again for Germany. The devastation was not only the destruction of cities, it was political as well.
In their occupation zone, the British worked with the Germans, building on what was best in their nation and helping them face their own tragedy. This drew on Germany's proud cultural heritage, its technological prowess, and its deep philosophical tradition. This was a fruitful approach. Re-education was aimed to counter the malign influence of the Nazis. Leaders such as Konrad Adenauer and later Willy Brandt, who had never been reconciled with the Nazis, were encouraged.
There was a great deal of emphasis on the building of new institutions.
They even noticed this funny little car and predicted a great future for it. The thinking behind this presentation was stimulated by a New Statesman article by Philip Alterman. From Politics to Football, What Can We Learn from Germany? He summarises how Britain contributed to German recovery.
Many of the features that make Germany so successful were installed by the British after the Second World War. The mandatory representation of workers on management panels, or the ponderous federal structure of the government, which encourages long-term policy strategies over short-term fixes, and has arguably made the country a more egalitarian place than London-centric Britain. We argue that Germany is a great European success story, and that this owes something to our enlightened approach to its reconstruction after 1945, Year Zero.
Its young people have a confidence which is not born of militarism. Germany is democratic and prosperous and plays a significant role in Europe.
Its education system, which Britain played a large part in setting up, emphasises atonement for the past. The image shows the Berlin Holocaust Memorial.
Do we have to go up the same blind alleys?
War crimes in Iraq. Abu Ghraib.
A nuclear launch dashboard. The key ready to turn at a moment's notice.
The Twin Towers. Anything goes in the name of corrupt religion.
Palestinian refugee camp. A festering sore in the Middle East.
Russian troops in Ukraine. Do you ever get the feeling that you have been here before?
The civil war in Syria. Many of our problems meet here. Factions, tyranny, sectarianism, and interference by outside states.
Most foreign and security policy is about national interest. Security means military force. This is what diplomats spend their time talking about. Does this mean the survival of the state as an institution, or the well-being of its people? Or is it really about securing the control of dominant elites?
The security of actual people, you and I and the world's poor, is not about armies and weapons, and certainly not nuclear weapons. It is about the necessities of a decent life.
A decent income, which allows more than endless grinding labour just to survive. Easily preventable diseases, such as malaria, still threaten the world's poor. Far too many states still exploit and repress their own people. In many places, the repression is at the hands of warlords, factions, and terrorists.
Too many people are denied the right to their own way of worshipping God, or to none at all. They are the victims of corrupt religion.
Cybercrime, the international drugs trade, and terrorism threaten all of us as individuals and as communities.
There is more than enough food in the world to feed us all. The problem is getting it to the people who need it. The same is true of clean water.
Threats such as our exploitation of the world's resources and climate change take second place to bloated spending on armaments. In too many places, lives cannot flourish because of discrimination based on gender, sexuality, or race. These issues are global and cannot be resolved by states acting alone. But there are indications of a way forward. Organised and well-informed citizen groups, working with experts and amenable states, have succeeded in marginalising the deployment and use of inhuman weapons, such as cluster munitions and anti-personnel mines. The same approach to nuclear weapons is now gaining momentum. States basing their security on naked power rightly fear this because it threatens the very legitimacy of their authority.
Consider again the philosophy of Harry Lime.
Nobody thinks in terms of human beings. Governments don't. Why should we?
Would you really feel any pity if one of those dots stopped moving forever?
Well, we can talk about what Harry Lime said in our final discussion.